Okay, we have quite a few people, so I think we'll get started. Welcome everyone tonight to our webinar, Discovering Deco DC. My name is Zachary Burt, and I'm the Community Outreach and Grants Manager at the DC Preservation League. For those of you who may be new to DCPL, we are a Washington, DC citywide nonprofit founded in 1971, and we are dedicated to preserving, protecting, and enhancing the historic built environment of the nation's capital. Before we get started, I have a few things to go over. First, I'd like to take a moment to thank our many top sponsors whose annual financial support helps underwrite free programs like this one today. They are the DC Commission on the Arts and Humanities, QTAC Rock, Douglas Development, Antunovich Associates, Buyer Blender Bell, EHT Traceries, and KCE Structural Engineers. Thank you all for your dedication to historic preservation in DC. Moving on, we have a few notes about how tonight's webinar will run. If you have a question, please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and I will go through the questions and ask Steve near the end of the program. And then the chat will not be available during the presentations, but will be open during the discussion period. And now that we've covered that, I would like to introduce tonight's speaker, Steve Knight. Steve Knight has served as president of the Art Deco Society since 2016. He is a practicing architect and principal with David M. Schwartz Architects here in Washington. Steve enjoys collecting Art Deco antiques, lecturing on the era's design and architecture. He has organized and conducted a number of walking tours on behalf of ADSW over the years. And during my 4 years at DCPL, I've been able to work closely with Steve on a number of different landmark nominations. So it's great to welcome Steve tonight. Good to see you.
Great. Thank you, Zach. Greetings, everybody. Good to be with you all this evening. Look forward to sharing a little bit more about Art Deco. And I think as the cover slide here hopefully makes clear, this is kind of a special time this year for us. It marks the 100th anniversary of the great exposition on Art Deco that opened in Paris that year, in April of that year, and ran for about 6 months and concluded in November. I'll talk a little bit more about that, but I think what's most exciting to us is there's something really special about centennial anniversaries and the ability to sort of look back and think about history and how it affects where we are today. And while this was the 100th anniversary of something in Paris, it's what we're going to see over the next 10 years, give or take, is a series of centennial exhibit celebrations that celebrate how Art Deco came to the US, its impact on the States, and how we then ultimately exported Art Deco around the world in our own way. So the way the talk is structured, I want to first go over sort of really give you a fuller understanding of what Art Deco is. I'll do that by looking into some of its origins, how the style evolved, and then ultimately we'll look at how the style is really defined, what are its features, what makes Art Deco Art Deco. We'll then take a brief tangent looking at kind of a parallel development we call industrial design or product design, which really came into its own during the Art Deco era of the late 20s and early 30s. And then, of course, we'll conclude by looking at a handful of examples of Art Deco in Washington. These are curated to really focus on the success of preservation and where that is overlapped and intersected with Art Deco. And in particular, the partnerships that DCPL and the Art Deco Society of Washington have undertaken together to help those successes come to fruition. So this first part here, think of this as a really brief crash course of architectural history or modern art history, if you will. It is by no means all-encompassing. Think of it, the way I like to think of it is it's sort of a slice of the pie. If you imagine the beginning at the center of the pie, we're looking at those unique influences that made Art Deco what it was. Where did it come from? It didn't come out of the blue, but it came from something. It came from a variety of influences and origins. So starting with the Industrial Revolution and its effect on products in the manufacture of goods, really scaling manufacturing and goods making up to a very humongous scale, if you will. There's a lot of good that came out of the Industrial Revolution. The ability to make goods on a broad scale, make them accessible and affordable. Interchangeable parts is another unique aspect that whole concept that came out of the Industrial Revolution. I'm sure we remember that from our early history courses. There was a lot of bad that came out of the Industrial Revolution as well. And I don't mean to get political here, but one could argue the exploitation of the worker, exploitation of youth in the workplace, obviously, was a serious issue. But really what I'm focused on here is the amount of absolute dreck that came out of the Industrial Revolution. I'm talking about products that came out of it, where this aspect of the revolution is so focused on production and delivery. There's just a total disregard for aesthetics and good taste. And the chair that's shown on the left is a really good example of that. It was made out of paper mache and some sort of faux velvet material for the upholstery. Perfectly dreadful. That is my candid assessment. You may disagree with that, but let's just run with that and indulge me for a few minutes here as I try to make my point. So as we know, art history is it's a series of developments and counter developments, ideas, and then new ideas that tend to run counter to or in reaction to previous ideas. And the first place to look after the Industrial Revolution for a good example of that is the arts and crafts movement. This is an absolute reaction to all those negatives that I described of the Industrial Revolution. What is really embraced here is the hand of the craftsperson, really an honest expression of materials, a real appreciation for natural materials, and again, the hand of the maker that is making those things. There's an interest in returning to fundamental aesthetic principles in making things that are either, as the saying went, that were either beautiful or useful for your home. Otherwise, they should not go into your home. This movement, of course, starts in Great Britain with William Morris, in particular, one of the key founders of the movement. When it comes to the States, we tend to think of it as the craftsman style that we see in so many wonderful bungalow houses, whether we're in Cleveland Park or faraway places like Pasadena, California. That's how that style and ethos sort of manifests itself in the States. Of course, Gustav Stiglitz was a great proponent of it with beautiful home decor and handmade objects and furniture. It is a very broad category, this arts and crafts movement. We're generally talking the late 19th century up to World War I. There are lots of sub-variants within it that look aesthetically different. You can't mistake an arts and crafts bungalow in Northwest Washington for Art Nouveau that one would find very easily in places like Paris or Brussels. But the philosophy, the underlying principles and tenets behind both of those aesthetic expressions are very much the same and simpatico with one another. What Art Nouveau really does, it's a very what's interesting about Art Nouveau, it's a movement that is very easily defined, and it's so encompassing. It touched everything from architecture to decorative arts, printmaking, design, clothing, fashion, you name it. And it was a true, at its height, it was a real, what it was trying to do was really embrace and express nature and natural-like forms, particularly plants. And I would argue that in the examples you see here, the one on the left in Paris, the one on the right in Brussels. When you really look at some of these shapes, whether it's the expression of the iron in the railing here on this staircase, or the railing elements of the Paris metro entrance, I would argue these forms, they're even more plant-like looking than actual plants. Again, it's a whole idea here, and when it's taken to its heights, greatest height, it's applied to everything. Another subvariant, and obviously looks very different aesthetically, and I would, as I've thought about this in preparation for tonight, a new term that I've sort of come to think of as I think of the work of the Wiener Werkstatt. This is in Vienna at roughly the same time, early 20th century, in the lead up to World War I. It's much more geometric and pared down. But anyway, this term that I've been thinking of, this to me is very much sort of the missing link that really brings us from high arts and crafts into what we come to think of as Art Deco. You see, again, it's a similar ethos in that it's a really complete aesthetic philosophy that's applied to everything, whether in these cases it's the architecture or the carpet or the furniture or the other decorative objects. It's complete. It's obviously very much focused on more planar geometry, purer shapes, simpler rectangular shapes, purer, more ordered, visibly obvious patterns and geometries. And it's people like Joseph Hoffman that really bring this to the fore and really practice it at a very high level. And it really came to its fullest height in Vienna. One of the best examples, incidentally, one finds in Brussels. The Palais Stocklet is in Brussels. That's the picture of that on the left. So as we start to think about how all these things come together and inform Art Deco, and I think that's what makes Art Deco so interesting, is it borrows very widely from a broad variety of different aesthetic influences. It incorporates everything from very sort of high, pure modernist ideals like Piet Mondrian's paintings that you see an example of that, an earlier example in the upper right. What was known as the international style of architecture that runs almost parallel to Art Deco. It's generally thought of as sort of a higher art form because it was so pure. But that's Le Corbusier's Villa Savoye, just outside of Paris in the lower right. Of course, the Art Nouveau, you still see hints of Art Nouveau. We do have to keep in mind that artistic evolution, it is organic. There aren't just sort of pure off and on switches, but rather things do sort of evolve at almost a plastic-like evolution from one step to the next as the years go by. But anyway, some of the aspects of Art Nouveau, I think you do still see playing out in early Art Deco. Of course, Russian constructivism in the upper left, and then Cubism with the Braque painting in the upper center. There's a sense of movement there and planarity and the overlapping of shapes and the way they overlap. I think if you squint your eyes at that, and if you squint your eyes at some decorative motifs in early Art Deco, I think you'll see those relationships and how they sort of come forward into Art Deco. They say seeing is believing. I think another way to turn a phrase would be that comparing is believing. So here you have two examples of wrought iron handmade gates, ornamental gates, entry gates. The one on the left is clearly Art Nouveau. The one on the right is clearly high Art Deco. They're both, I believe, French in origin. And if you just think and look at the way they're different and how they approach ornamentation and pattern and shape differently. Obviously, the Art Nouveau example, it's very natural and curvaceous and flowing. There's very little repetition. Yes, you do see a few motifs that repeat, but it's trying to be very natural in appearance, so you don't see a lot of repetition. And again, it's very flowing and almost sort of biological in its sensibilities. Whereas the Art Deco example, and again, this is early Art Deco, this is probably from the mid 1920s. You see the geometry. You look at each of those swirls, they are perfectly formed and they perfectly circle in with regularity. And they're repetitious. You see that same swirl repeated over and over again. There's a degree of simplicity to it because of just that. It looks almost like it's made by a machine. Yes, some mechanization was involved, but it was forged by hand in a blacksmith shop, just the way the Art Nouveau example was on the left. So again, hopefully some comparing there helps to drive some of the aesthetic sensibilities home. I'll dive into a few more of the character defining features in a minute as well. Art Deco, it's a very broad term, as in broad in that it captures a very broad period of history. We're talking roughly the period between the two world wars, 1919 to 1939. You do see some elements of Art Deco continue wherever design or the making of goods and buildings happened during World War II. You still see it. And even after World War II, you still see some last gasps of Art Deco. The term, incidentally, it's relatively new. It did not exist. Nobody really thought of it as Art Deco back in the day, in the 20s and the 30s. Rather, that is a term that was it began to be thrown about in the late 1960s as art historians and collectors were looking back at this period and of design history and seeing a lot of commonality. And the term was loosely coined from that Paris exhibit that I mentioned earlier, the 1925 Exposition Internationale des Arts Décoratifs et Industriels Modernes. That gets translated into English. And then from that, we sort of pare down and we get the term Art Deco, but it just kind of stuck. There are other terms that you encounter along the way, depending on where you might be within that 25 to 30 year period of history. Sometimes you see moderne or art moderne. Regionally, you encounter what's known as Pueblo Deco in the American Southwest. And then as the style evolves into the 30s, we start to see the term streamlined associated with the style and even streamlined deco. American Perpendicular was an interesting one that was supposedly coined by Ralph Walker. You'll see an example of his work a little later on here in Washington, but he designed a number of really important buildings during the era. So at the end of the day, again, we're talking about this period between the two world wars. The term didn't exist back then. I think it's simply put, it's what we would consider to be modern at the time, modern as in contemporary. It's what was sort of in vogue. This is a very eclectic time in architectural expression as well. We still see Tudor and Gothic and all the revival styles continuing, but let's sort of set that aside and let's just focus on Art Deco for the sake of this talk. To pivot a little bit and let's think about the evolution and kind of from back to that historical perspective. I start here with the end of the Great War in Europe, incredibly destructive. Yes, the US did participate for the last couple of years, but we just did not experience firsthand the physical destruction, the huge death toll, the sheer violence firsthand in our own backyards the way they did in Europe, particularly in Northern Europe, particularly in France, the northern regions of France and Belgium. This is a shot after the Great War of a small city called Saint-Quentin. It was literally just about flattened almost entirety. The founders, if you will, decided very early on that they wanted to rebuild the city. They wanted to do it very intentionally. They wanted to build very well, and they wanted to build in this modern style. So even before Paris, that great exposition, 1925, we're already seeing examples of the style evolve slowly. And you may, as you look at some of these, you may see some hints and some of overlap with Art Nouveau. I think that's only to be expected, again, if one thinks about the organic nature of aesthetic art design evolution. But these are great examples of early Art Nouveau, early Art Deco. It's the entire town, again, with great intentionality, great care, and great expense, was rebuilt in this early Art Deco style. It's a great living laboratory. In fact, I'm going to have the opportunity to travel here next month as part of the International Congress on Art Deco. So that's some of the background that really leads up to Paris. So really, by 1925, the style is really fully formed and being practiced and employed by great designers. Émile Jacques Rouman is a really famous, noteworthy interior designer who designed a number of beautiful pieces of furniture. His style is fully formed and very much contributing to Art Deco as early as 1920. So anyway, so here we are, 1925, this great moment in Paris. It was this World's Fair, if you will, had been planned and thought about for a number of years. It was originally supposed to take place in 1915. Obviously, it was put off because of the war. It was even then delayed a couple of times. It finally came together in 1925 in Paris. It's very much a Eurocentric exposition. About 20 countries across Europe and into Asia as well are represented here. There are hundreds and hundreds of exhibitors. All of the pavilions were very consciously designed with some of the greatest architects and their interiors by some of the greatest designers. A number of them were provided not just by countries themselves, but also suppliers and manufacturers and even retailers. Some of the greatest department stores in Paris had pavilions, like the Galerie Lafayette that you see pictured here on the right. One of the best documented ones is pictured on the left. That's the Pavilion for a Collector. Pierre Patou was the architect of the exterior, and Rollman did all of the interiors. So this is what one would encounter, just acres and acres of beautiful design in the pavilions and the wares and the interiors inside. And speaking of interiors, these are the interiors of a couple of the pavilions, a couple of the rooms. Again, you can see the style here is fully formed as we now think of it as sort of high Art Deco. Very ornamental. There's a great appreciation for, again, if we just think back for a moment, back to what I was talking about with the arts and crafts movement, the appreciation of materials, of handicraft. It's all here, it's all represented. But at the same time, there's this interesting overlap with the geometry and the repetition, and really ultimately it's sort of a romantic embrace of the machine. And if one just pauses and thinks about the Great War and how that war managed to embrace the machine for very destructive purposes, this is going 180 degrees and trying to find the good in the machine, if you will, and really celebrating and expressing machine-like qualities in the aesthetics and the ornamentation. The upper the image on the left, when I look at that little sort of Juliet balcony that you see with the fluted bits and the big sort of half round terminus on the bottom, that is so bold and modern. When I first saw this image, and I couldn't believe that that was 1925. It just looks years ahead in design thinking. So you notice I didn't mention the United States. I said this is a very Eurocentric affair, this great exposition. Herbert Hoover was then Secretary of Commerce. He received the solicitation from the French to participate. Long story short, his view was that, well, the US doesn't have any modern design. We're not going to participate. To slightly expand on that, and as you delve into this a little bit further, it was actually quite a bit more complex, and there was a lot of back and forth as to what the US should do. A number of individuals in manufacture and design and associated with museums of art very much wanted the US to participate. So while we did not participate, as in we did not submit anything for exposition. We did not design and build a pavilion or anything like that. But we did participate in a very different way, which I think was ultimately very influential. And it's really how Art Deco came to the US. And the picture of the three gentlemen here on the left focused primarily on Charles Russell Richards in the middle. He was then the lead of the American Association of Museums, and he lobbied very hard for the US to participate. And when the final decision was made, he still tried to find opportunity. And what he convinced the government to do was that, well, why we won't submit anything, let's send a delegation over. So we did just that. And then on top of that, the delegation will then come together afterwards and produce a report. That was the initial intention of his efforts. So there was a core group of a couple of dozen, and then it was augmented with nearly 100 participants from the US went over as part of this sort of official delegation. Obviously, hundreds, if not thousands, more went over as spectators, including a number of designers and architects. But anyway, so Richards leads this delegation. They love what they see. They produce their report. And then they come up with the idea of, well, what we should really do is we should bring some of these examples of great design back to the US and let's tour them around the country. So what they developed was a traveling exhibit of about 400 objects that went to, I believe, 7 or 8 museums in major cities within the US. And interestingly, a number of those museums afterwards, they realized the value of what they were exhibiting. So a number of them actually bought pieces out of that traveling exhibit to then incorporate into their own collections. So the images that you see on the right are evidence of the traveling exhibit making its way to St. Louis in 1926. This all happened over the course of that year. And then on top of that, a couple of major department stores in the US also developed their own exhibits that were probably a little more accessible because they were fully intent on marketing household goods to middle income and upper middle income Americans. So really by the late 20s, we're really in full swing, and aspects of great Art Deco design, the sophistication, luxury where it can be applied in the late 20s are all really being very quickly embraced here. So to then pause and think about early Art Deco in the States. Obviously, the Chrysler Building is one of the best examples. It's one we all know very well, and it's a great example of this high Art Deco. It is while it is machine-like and modern and pared down, it is very much embracing ornamentation, particularly obviously with the crown at the top, very distinctive. But if you've ever been inside the lobby of this building, it is resplendent with beautiful materials and great ornamentation. The other example shown here is a railing not from the Chrysler building, but this is from a very modest City Hall building outside of Pittsburgh. And you see here, again, all of those aspects that I talked about earlier, the repetition, the geometrization, if I can get that word out of my mouth, of the ornament. It's all very much in full force here, even in a very modest commission in Middle America. One often thinks of skyscrapers when one thinks of Art Deco. There's obviously the term skyscraper deco that a lot of us have heard at one time or another. That tends to be associated with New York. Interestingly, a lot of those character defining features are not really, they don't come from Art Deco, but rather they come from the zoning ordinance that New York enacted very early in the century. And the goal of that ordinance was to get, as buildings grew taller, to get them to step back away from the street to preserve light and natural light and air for the lower stories and people in smaller scale buildings and just down at the street. And then just over time, particularly as some of these aspects of Art Deco begin to find their way into design and architecture thinking in the States, that level of sculpting, if you will, just it's applied with such care and aplomb and sophistication. It just really grows alongside Art Deco. So it sort of becomes character defining to Art Deco in the US really by accident. This is the Chanin building. It's directly across the street corner from the Chrysler building. So if you're ever in that part of New York, you can get a 2-for-1 very easily. What's most interesting about this building to me is focusing on the lower floors, which is what you're seeing in the image on the right. And again, you're seeing all those aspects of the ornamentation that overlap with early Art Deco applied here. That very floral panel motif that you see around that frieze of windows. If you look closely, you'll see that the motif is repeated. And what this actually is, if you squint closely, you'll see that it's large format tiles that are made out of cast terracotta. And it's just like a wallpaper pattern. It just repeats. But again, it's done in a very geometric, machine-like way. As the style evolves into the 30s, alongside the Depression, it gets very pared down, and this is where streamlining starts to come into play. Yes, one could argue that this is the 1930s, this is the Great Depression, and there's a sense of economy here, just because we can't afford the ornament and the detail like we had in the 1920s. There's probably some truth to that, but I think at the same time, what's really at play here, the real sort of philosophical idea is paring down and streamlining. There's something very uplifting about that. And a sense of optimism that you get from that is what's really needed to bear with something as horrible as an economic depression. So we're looking for optimism and wherever we can find it, and we obviously want to find it and express it in design. So these are some great examples. A house in Texas on the left. It's a famous building in LA in the center. And then, of course, one of the hotels in Miami Beach on the right. And I think that's an interesting example to touch on for two reasons. One is, while it is streamlined and pared down, and you see it with the rounded corners and the visors that reinforce that movement, you do also see some very clear nods to just pure decoration and exuberance in the middle. It's like they just couldn't help themselves. And There's some real joy in that ornamentation and the detail. And I think it also points again to the overlap and sort of that organic evolution. We still carry some of those earlier notions of ornament and decoration forward into the style, even into the mid to late 1930s. The other one to point out, it's a really interesting thing to think about, is the economic aspects of why are we building so many hotels? And there were literally hundreds of these hotels built in Miami Beach at the height of the Great Depression. So just hold that thought for a minute and I'll come back to it. We talked at great length about Paris 1925. I will promise I won't talk at such great length about Chicago in 1933, 34, but it is very important. And what's important here is this is one of the next really seminal World's Fairs that's very much defining and in step with Art Deco and its evolution. And it occurs in the States. And it's really the first time that we see a full embrace of the style, not only from a sense of let's import what they're doing in Europe, but we've taken it a step further and we've made it our own. And this is where those aspects of streamlining and paring down really come into play. We can argue about where those came from. A number of the designers from Europe came to the States, but there was an opportunity to experiment in a way here in the States that probably wasn't quite available in Europe at the time. But at any rate, you see, again, we call this Art Deco, but it looks very different from the examples that I showed you in Paris in 1925. There's a sense of you really see the shapes read through very boldly here in both examples on the outside. And then as much as we did with Paris, we go inside to a couple of pavilions and you see, again, the style is fully formed. Again, it's different. It's more pared down. It's streamlined. There's an even stronger embrace of, I think, of geometry and pattern here than we see because we've lost some of the shackles of the need for just wanton ornament and decoration that we had in the 1920s. And then to just step outside of the world of architecture for a moment, because there are so many different influences and there's different ways that the style finds its way around the world. And it really is a style that you find in all corners of the world. Yes, there are regional variations, but it is so universal. And one finds great Art Deco everywhere, from the Philippines to Sydney and Melbourne, Australia, throughout Europe, of course, and even in interesting corners of Africa, including Durban and South Africa in particular, has some great examples of Art Deco. How did it get there? Obviously, there's great translation in transportation with its growing efficiencies, with steamship ocean liners and even air travel in some cases. People can get around more easily. The proliferation of magazines and journals that focused on design that even grows more. So designers and architects in faraway places are getting influenced by what they see in print. But movies is another really interesting one. And this is we were at the height of the Hollywood studio system in the 1930s, where we're cranking out visually resplendent movies as fast as we can in Hollywood. And they're finding their way around the world. And there's great evidence of one really very prolific and well-regarded Art Deco designer outside of Buenos Aires in northern Argentina. He was very much influenced by the films that came out of Hollywood. And you do see that influence in his work. I mentioned at the very beginning, I was going to touch on industrial design because it is really an interesting aspect that while we're not focused on architectural examples, we can see here aesthetic principles that apply to not only the products that you see here, but to some of the buildings that, or a lot of the buildings that you see from the era as well. And you did literally have designers that were working across broadly different mediums. Raymond Loewy, for example, not only did he design steam locomotives and the Greyhound bus and the Coca-Cola bottle, but he also designed buildings. So there is literal crossover there. But I think the aesthetic principles that applied to the architecture clearly apply to the product design. And I think in a number of respects, they probably started with product design because it was more sort of, there's a more ready need perhaps with the proliferation of electricity that designers could experiment. I asked you to hold a thought about the Great Depression from all the hotels that were built in Miami Beach a couple of minutes ago. I'll come back to that now. And the point I wanted to make was that, yes, it's the Great Depression. There's a lot of depravity, a lot of people out of work, but there were also a lot of people that still had jobs. And we're looking at anywhere of upwards of 15 to 20% unemployment, but that very much depended on where you were regionally in the country and also what specific year of that decade we're talking about. And a lot of people who had jobs had relatively good jobs. I'm thinking of blue-collar jobs that were bolstered with organized labor, the advent of the 2-week paid vacation. That's why you have all those hotels that are very modest, 3- and 4-story walk-up scale hotels in places like Miami Beach, because that's where middle-income Americans could go for a modest vacation. And design comes into play here as well, because these people need objects, they need appliances, they need housewares in their homes. And so really great design becomes a really defining feature in marketing. And it's really where this notion of consumerism really comes into full force. And a number of producers and manufacturers, they're using great design to distinguish their projects and compete that way. And I think we still see that today. This is one interesting example that shows what some of these great designers did. People like Walter Doran Teague. This is a commission that he had to reimagine, if you will, the Wiz sales book register. I'm sure a lot of us remember this. This is the thing with the hand crank. You fill out the receipt by hand. It fills it out in triplicate with carbon paper. You then pull the lever and it spits one receipt out that you give to the customer. You put another in the register and the third one goes into the file. And he didn't invent the object. He didn't really improve its operation, but he just simply made it look better with a new cover, new packaging, if you will. And he made the thing just way more accessible and approachable and ultimately successful for the American sales book company. And there are myriad examples like this one, but you can see what the thing looked like in the early 1920s before Teague gets a hold of it. You can see what it looks like after he has streamlined it and reimagined its exterior. There's myriad examples in automotive design as well. I think they're some of the best because you really get a sense of what streamlining is all about. You're trying to get something to look like it's moving faster. It looks more efficient. It looks like it's moving when it's even standing still. So hopefully that gives you a pretty good understanding of all these fundamental principles, the aesthetics of Art Deco. Now we're going to pivot to and look at a few examples here in and around Washington. Again, this is primarily to focus on some preservation successes. I think before we can do that, we have to acknowledge that there was a great deal of great Art Deco design that's been lost in Washington. Probably one of the most notable examples, and it's actually where what inspired the development of our own organization's logo that you see in the lower left, was the famous Translux Theater, well, famous to some, on 14th Street downtown. This was started, it was known as a newsreel theater, and in its heyday, this is where you could walk in at any time. The lights were not dark, they were at kind of a mid-light level, and you could just see newsreels that would just repeat over and over again. To me, it was the then equivalent of clicking on your browser and seeing what's up in the world on the Washington Post website or CNN or whatever your news feed of choice is. But that's how it was back then. A really exceptional building, and had this wonderful prismatic marquee and awning over the entry. And this is really beautiful and very opalescent and very noticeable at night because it lights up with lights inside the glass prism there. And this was lost in the mid-1970s, very sadly, before a Preservation Act was came into being, and really before I think there was a full appreciation of what Art Deco was, which really doesn't come until the early 1980s. But really pivoting to some successes and some wonderful buildings that are still with us and very much loved and cared for and appreciated. I mentioned Ralph Walker earlier. This is his one example here in Washington, D.C. This is the telephone exchange across from the Marriott Hotel at Metro Center. The facade has just been restored, so it looks really good now. If you're in that neighborhood, please check it out. And focus on the ornamentation in the spandrel panels. These are the stone panels between the windows stacked vertically. And you see this really interesting marriage of very sort of chiseled, bold geometric forms, like you see at the window head. And then from there, they sort of gradually transitioned into something that's very plant-like and organic. It's almost like this, if Art Deco and Art Nouveau got together, this would be their love child. But I absolutely love this building. It's a very modest scale. Just a couple of blocks away is it was known as the Brownlee's Confectioners when it was built. It had a candy shop, retail shop on the ground floor, and then the upper floors were for offices and also, more importantly, where they made the candy. And what's so beautiful and really noteworthy about this building is the full embrace of aluminum as the metal of choice in all the ornamentation. I would imagine a number of these panels that you see could be ordered out of a catalog. That is kind of a guess on my part, but it's just so beautifully done, and they're just so exuberant. I think it's a great example of high Art Deco right here in our own backyard. And the storefront over time had been lost. It was actually recreated and put back a number of years ago, and it's now a district taco, so you can go there for lunch sometime and enjoy its Art Deco splendor. Sedgwick Gardens, one of the great apartment houses on Connecticut Avenue in Cleveland Park. Architect Mirhan Mesrobian is one of my personal favorite architects here in Washington. He was an Armenian immigrant who came to the States around 1920. And I guess I'll make a pitch for Caroline Hickman's lecture about her grandfather, Mesrobian, Mirhan Mesrobian. That's going to be by the Society of Architectural Historians next week. So check that out through the La Trobe chapter's website. Anyway, he was a real success story. He came to the States, barely spoke English, very talented. He went to work for Harry Wardman and was the in-house architect for a number of years. And then when Wardman went broke, Mirhan Mesrobian struck out on his own. And this was his first building. And it really, I think of it was kind of a swan song for him because it speaks lovingly of architectural heritage that one would find closer to home where he grew up in Turkey and Armenia. Um, really very interesting decorative motifs on the exterior with this sort of geometric sundial at the top of the elevator penthouse. Um, and it's a really interesting mashup, I think, of Art Deco and those other design elements. Um, you see the Art Deco influence with the horizontal line, white banding that's in brick or stone in some cases. It really gives a sense of movement. We often call those horizontal lines speed lines. They're very good at sort of binding together an architectural expression and just giving it a degree of simplicity. But there's so much going on here. This building is almost beyond characterization. And then when you focus in on the porte cochere, you see this really interesting geometric, almost Byzantine-like screen element in the half-circle window above the porte cochere awning. It carries to the inside with this really over-the-top lobby that the Art Deco Society of Washington, we were privileged to work with Cleveland Park Historic to landmark designate the lobby successfully a few years ago. And we also then worked with the owners of the building as they to help them do some restoration work and some they wanted to make a few changes, and we helped them to make them do them in a very thoughtful, sympathetic manner. But it has this really interesting six-sided skylight in the center that centers over a fountain with a statue figure in the middle, and wonderful terrazzo flooring. This is all decorative plaster on the walls, a scagliola plaster, which is plaster that's made to look like, in this case, marble or other types of stone or travertine, but it's perfectly beautiful. In the single family house category, two interesting examples to point out. This was Morris Cafritz's house. The Cafritz, another notable Washington, D.C. developer. This was the house that he did. He used local architects Avenel and Edwards, who did a number of his apartment buildings, to design the architecture of the house, the exterior. But then he encountered the work of Eugene Shane, that's how that name is pronounced, who he then commissioned to be the interior designer. Shane did all the furniture, all of the decorative work in the house as well. The house, interestingly, is now the home of the Field School, a really interesting, probably almost bizarre adaptive reuse story, but the house is still with us. It's still mostly intact. A few of the interior features and maybe some of the exterior features have been lost or modified over time, but we're still very thankful to have it with us. Looking to the inside, still mostly intact. That's the main stair hall in the center. And down on the lower level, there were some fun sort of, I guess you'd call this a rec room, or I think Shane was going after a speakeasy vibe with the Naugahyde clad bar front on the right. And then on the left is a sort of seating alcove just around the corner from the bar. And that mantle surround it, it's actually all copper. And then that's a hand-painted mural in the center. Just really wonderful. And again, it's all still with us. It's really interesting to note that all the spaces in the house, they're either used for administrative offices, or in some instances like this one, they actually do hold classes and seminars in these spaces. I don't know if you can see it, but I think might be a student's backpack peeking out in one corner of the bar there on the right. The Nixon Mounsey House, we're really thankful to the DC Preservation League for writing the landmark designation that was successfully adopted, I believe, last year. This is a really interesting house, not only for its design and aesthetics, but also the social history behind the house's architect, William D. Nixon, an African American who came to Washington with his parents in about 1871 or 72. He basically was raised here. He was a hometown boy, even though he wasn't born here. But Nixon he was very talented. You could argue he was mostly self-taught, although he did go to school and learned art and drafting. He came back and taught for a number of years at the Dunbar School. He was an art teacher and drawing teacher. But he clearly his first love must have been design and architecture. And in 1950, his daughter Ethel Nixon Mounsey, that's where the Mounsey name comes into play from her married name, comes into play. And Ethel commissions her father to design this house on a lot that they had purchased on University Terrace in the Palisades neighborhood, which was thankfully it was not subject to any racial covenants, which were very much in force elsewhere at the time. But this was an area that was very prominent after the Civil War, where African Americans formerly enslaved could purchase tracts of land, and that's why they were able to build this fabulous house here. It's very late in the period, as you can see, 1950. This year, you're really seeing the last gasps, I think, of streamlined modernity here, but they're all all those motifs and tenants are very beautifully employed, and the rounded corners, the glass block. I think that's just a perfect composition on the front of this house. And then just the way everything comes together, the way the details come together in the entrance are just really exceptional. The house is very much loved and cared for by its current owners. These are the interiors that are pretty much, for the most part, well, probably a little more pared down. When you look at some historic images of the home, you'll see more wallpaper and a little more sort of fussy decoration. But the current owners very much love the house. They very much appreciate it. They were very much supportive of the original, of the designation. But a really wonderful nods to streamlined modern design with the curvilinear motifs, the curving corners. You see in the dining room here, the interesting recess in the ceiling, the glass block. Really wonderful little compact and efficient plan here. That's the primary entrance level there on the right. Just a really great example. And I think we're really all very thankful that it's with us. It's not only is it protected, but it's also owned and lived in by people who really love it and care for it. A really important example that has its own interesting history and track record, and maybe even that history should be landmark designated at this point. It goes back really 40 plus years. It's the former Greyhound bus terminal at 1100 New York Avenue. It's now part of, it was adaptively reused and restored and preserved and incorporated into an office building. Just to touch on what the original building was for a moment. But before I do, I will pause here. Are we doing okay on time, Zach? I'll keep going. I've got just a couple more examples and probably about another 5 or 10 minutes. I can power through it a little quicker.
Yeah, how about 5 more minutes and then we can have a few questions. How does that sound?
Sounds good. Thank you. The original building was called an island unit station. It was very revolutionary because it separated the pedestrian and taxi traffic, those approaching or leaving as passengers from the bus traffic. And the shape of the building with this rounded back in the corners, it's just perfectly expressive of the traffic and the motion of the buses. It was very much celebrated when it opened in 1940. It has really fascinating social history. Obviously, it opened at the height, or rather, it was very instrumental during World War II. with tremendous amounts of traffic of troops and others moving in and out. It's also very much celebrated, and I think we're just really now starting to appreciate its history in contributing to civil rights as one of the starting points for a number of freedom rides, first in the late 1940s, and then, of course, in the early 1960s. The building, as you can imagine, bus stations fell on hard times. At one point, there was a really misbegotten move to cover the building in a slipcover of standing seam metal to sort of modernize it. Perfectly hideous. Thankfully, that was we knew the original building was intact underneath, and that was all peeled away. And after a number of years of just sort of battling back and forth to figure out what do we do with this thing, the best adaptive reuse scheme finally came into being with the erection of this 11, 12-story office building behind it. That's a really fascinating image on the right there, where they're excavating for the below-grade parking and other floors directly behind the station. It's still fully shored up. The full volume and exterior envelope of the building is still fully intact. The half-round apse is now incorporated and sort of subsumed, if you will, underneath the office building, but you still get its full expression on the interior with the perfectly preserved lobby. Our two organizations recently partnered to submit a landmark designation for the interiors of the building, and that should be coming up for hearing in the next month or so. Obviously, the Uptown Theater, a lot of us know this one. We know it's sitting vacant. We understand there is a movement afoot by a new tenant called Art Deco to adaptively reuse the interior, still with a film presentation theme, but probably going in a slightly different direction. But this was one of a number of really important neighborhood movie theaters that sprang up around Washington in the 1930s. And it's representative of a pivot in the industry, going from very large palatial 1,000, 2,000 seat movie theaters, palaces downtown, to more decentralized neighborhood theaters that would seat several hundred people. And it really embraces great Art Deco design on the outside. The inside has undergone a number of changes over the years. So while we're concerned that the building, it finds the right use and the use is a sympathetic one, the interiors have been changed so much over the years that that's the original theater interior on the left. That does not exist anymore. Another fabulous adaptive reuse story is the Heck Company Warehouse on New York Avenue. This was landmark designated in the early 90s. It functioned as the Heck Company Warehouse for a few years after that, and then sat vacant while the right owner and right use could come along, if you will. And what happened was the Douglas Development Company purchased it. They originally thought of making it an office building. That wasn't going to work. So then they pivoted to apartment housing. To do that with these really large 100,000 square foot plates, which are much too big for apartment units, they carved strategically 3 courtyards into the building so that inward facing units could obviously have access to windows, natural light and air in the courtyards. And they did it in a really clever way. They actually preserved the original mushroom columns that stack up and are the primary structural support of the building. And not only did they restore and sort of freshen up, repair the exterior, they carried as much of the interior fabric through into the units as possible. So you really get a nice sense of the original story of the building, if you will, even to the point of leaving the original paint on the columns, which were color-coded so you knew where you were within the building. So those are a few examples. I'll just end here. These are a few resources that I have gone back to several times. The 2 versions of Washington Art Deco, with Rick Streiner in the center and the right. The one on the right is the original one with in partnership with Wirtz from 1984. And then more recently in 2014, the book was sort of repackaged and combined with heritage of Baltimore Art Deco with contributing author Melissa Blair. And then finally, if you're really interested in product design, The Streamlined Decade by Bush from 1975. It's out of print, but you can probably still find copies of that on Amazon or elsewhere. So thank you very much. I'll go ahead and stop sharing here, Zach, so we can open it up for questions.
Yeah, thank you, Steve. That was very comprehensive. I learned so much. So one question we have, and I think I know the answer to this, but is the interior of the former Greyhound station open to the public?
Yes, it is. The lobby is open during regular business hours. It's very much worth seeing. And there's an added treat, which is there's a historic exhibit that talks about the history of the Greyhound buses in one corner of the lobby. So it's worth checking out.
Okay, cool. And then also, when it comes to Art Deco, and I know you gave some examples from here in DC and some that are near and dear to my heart because they were nominations done by DCPL in collaboration with you guys. But where does DC fall really in the Art Deco world? Is it like kind of like we have a standard amount of Art Deco buildings or not that many compared to a city like New York, or you mentioned Miami Beach? Can you speak a little bit about DC comparatively?
I would say we sort of rank up as a standard example of Art Deco inventory. It tends to be a little decentralized. And not only do you have the city, but we also, of course, have our close-in suburbs, Silver Spring and Bethesda. Greenbelt has, of course, the New Deal era city, and then, of course, over the other side in Northern Virginia and Arlington, there's great examples. And I think most importantly, I think we have a number of great examples in the monumental core of the city. In particular, standout example for me is the Department of Justice building, where you see this overlap of Art Deco and classicism, Greco-Roman classicism, and the two are playing hand in hand with each other. I'm not sure if we're talking about Decoized classical or classicized Deco. I would probably argue for Decoized classical because I think it's Art Deco. It's sometimes I think of it not only as a style, but it's like it's an attitude. It's like an accent that you can apply to other styles. We often the term that was coined for this was Greco Deco. I know another great example that the Preservation League has submitted a nomination for is the Acacia Life Insurance building on Louisiana Avenue. Very much fits into that set of sensibilities.
Yeah, and I like Greco Deco. And yeah, also a shout out to the tour that you'll be doing on Sunday downtown. I know it's sold out and we have a wait list, but I'm assuming you're going to touch on some of that Art Deco down in the Federal Triangle area. So someone asked about a very famous building, so you'll have to address this one. Unless I missed it, is the Kennedy Warren a significant Art Deco example?
It is. It is probably the best of our apartment houses. Obviously, it's very high end, and they could afford it, and it's a standout because of that. We did make a conscious decision when Zach and I were preparing for this to really focus on the kind of the shared preservation success stories. So that obviously required some heavy editing, but yeah, clearly the Kennedy Warren is the standout.
Yeah, and you mentioned Sedgwick Gardens, which is also a personal favorite of mine. Any other ones that come to mind apartment house wise here in the city that you just want to do a quick name drop of for everyone?
Yeah, the one it's interesting. It's in the shadow of the Kennedy Warren. It's the Woodley Park Towers. It's on Devonshire Place, which is the little side street directly across.
Yeah, it has a little driveway with the fountain. Yeah, I know what
Yeah.
you're talking about. Yeah, that's a great building.
2929 Connecticut is more sort of later. So it's a later, sort of more modern example. It has these really interesting horizontal brick balconies. Um, and then I guess finally, it's not really a apartment building, but the hotel, the Omni Showroom on Calvert, that kind of overlooks Rock Creek Park, just as you're coming over the
Oh,
town
right.
edge.
Yeah,
That's a great example.
yeah, for sure. And then would you include Lincoln Theater and also yeah, so it's a two-part question. So would you consider the Lincoln Theater an Art Deco style building?
No, I think it's more of that's probably more of a romantic style building. I get a little bit of kind of Spanish Moorish um, when I think about it.
Mhm.
I don't have a picture. I feel like I
Yeah,
need to.
it's a little bit, maybe a little bit more classical in design, classical revival. And they're also asking too, if there's a full list of Art Deco properties. I can say at least from DC Preservation League standpoint on our DC Historic Sites website, there's a tour on there that has every historically designated Art Deco, Streamline Moderne, or Deco adjacent building. So check that out. And Steve, do you guys have a comprehensive list on your website?
We have a good representation. It is not comprehensive. And we are looking to add to it whenever we have a chance. So if that person is interested in helping us build the inventory with simple sort of windshield surveys and taking some photographs, if anybody's interested, we'd love the
Yes,
help.
for sure.
We try
Yeah,
and
we always need more surveyors, right, for preservation and architecture.
yeah, and I don't want to sound. I'm now looking at the Lincoln. I was mistaking it with another theater that had really important African American pedigree in Washington, and the Lincoln is not. I think I said Spanish Moorish, and it's not. You're right. It's more classical. Anyway, I had to get that out of my system.
Totally understand. And then also, of course, because we were focused on Connecticut, someone wanted to give a shout out to the Majestic over on 16th.
Oh, absolutely. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. And then by the way, I think someone's trying to raise their hand. If you want to put that into the chat, I can ask it for you. And then someone said, it's not a question, but a comment, just right over the state line. The Silver Theater on Colesville Road and Georgia Avenue in Silver Spring is a beautiful, streamlined, modern theater and is where the American Film Institute's Noir City Festival of Film Noir from October 10th to October 23rd.
I think I know who wrote that.
Thank you for the PSA. That was a good one. And then someone mentioned, and I know you guys had an event here, someone wanted to mention the restored Spanish ballroom out at Glen Echo. When you
Yes,
guys had your what, your 40th out there, or
40th out there. Yeah.
yeah, I remember that. That was a great event. Okay, and then one last question. It is fun to just throw these buildings at you, Steve, and hear your reaction. It's a fun game. Um, Someone asked, are there some good examples of industrial type buildings that are representative of the style?
Let's see. Well, the Heck Company Warehouse obviously is one. The Manhattan Laundry. What's the one with the glass block?
And where DCPL is, Manhattan Laundry,
Yeah, that's it. Yeah,
on
that one.
Florida at 14th.
Yeah. We have some would argue I think it's DC, it's Pepco's maintenance building. I think it's now owned by Howard University. It has that sort of Albert Kahn attitude of very muscular, simple brick piers and with a little bit of stone trim. It's a very economical example. Albert Kahn he was a famous Detroit architect who did a number of warehouses and, or excuse me, uh, 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 factories for the automotive industry in and around Detroit. But that's one. And then, interestingly, also with Pepco, they this is I have to put this. You have to put it somewhere. I think it would go into the industrial category, but they're power substations that one finds throughout the city and the Washington, Maryland, close in Maryland region. They would disguise them. And there's different theories as to why they did this. Some of them are in residential neighborhoods and they look like houses. And there are a couple of them that are in commercial districts and they look like commercial buildings. And the one in Tenleytown that we successfully landmarked a few years ago is a good example. There's a really interesting one directly across from Ford's Theater. It actually is no longer a substation, but it's like a 1950. So it's very late in the period. Facade is very much in sort of that modern style.
Mm-hmm.
There's not a lot of industry in Washington, so it's we don't therefore have a lot of good industrial examples of. Oh, I know. Again, the central heating plant. I think it's in Southwest DC. It was
by USDA.
Yeah, it was designed by Paul Cray, the great. He was a French expat who came over, and he did a number of buildings in Washington. He did the Folger Shakespeare Library, the Federal Reserve, the Klingle Valley Bridge. Very prolific architect. But anyway, I think the heating plant, it has some really wonderful design moves on it, and it's very much in the Art Deco vein.
Yeah, and I know that one's on our Art Deco tour that I mentioned on our website. So if anyone's interested, go check out that virtual tour. And you mentioned Klingle Valley Bridge, and I'm glad you did, because I think last time you gave us a presentation a few years ago, it was focused on Art Deco and transportation. I remember you focused more so on bridges and things like that. So just to close out, someone wanted to just mention also, of course, Department of Interior building with its Art Deco features. You had mentioned DOJ, but also, yeah, we should give a shout out to DOI. So with that, Steve, thank you so much. That was so interesting, and I always enjoy hearing from you.
My pleasure. Really enjoyed it.
And we look forward to continue to collaborate with you guys in the future.
Likewise.
Okay, have a good night, everyone.
Take care, all. Bye-bye.